In the hustle and bustle of life, sometimes the unexpected takes us on a journey we never imagined. Dorothy, a dedicated doctor, found herself at a grave, not just mourning the loss of a patient, but also the loss of her job and her confidence. She had followed every procedure, every rule, and yet here she was, standing at a crossroads, questioning everything. As she paid her respects, she overheard a conversation that shook her to the core, two strangers mocking her sorrow. But just as despair seemed to take hold, something incredible happened. A faint moan from the ground beneath the grave ignited a new spark in Dorothy. Joined by a familiar face from her past, Mr. Cobb, a former teacher turned caretaker, they unearthed not just a coffin but a living, breathing mystery. The man inside wasn't the businessman she thought she had failed, he was someone else entirely, trapped in a nightmare beyond explanation. As the night unfolded, Dorothy's despair transformed into determination. She rekindled a bond with Mr. Cobb and found herself entangled in a story far stranger than any medical case she'd ever encountered. Through it all, from the shadows of sorrow to the light of unexpected friendship, Dorothy realized that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, life has a way of surprising us with new beginnings. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. After losing her job, Dorothy found herself standing at the grave of a wealthy man whose life she couldn't save. The weight of failure hung heavy on her heart as she overheard a conversation between two men nearby. She chose to feign ignorance, pretending not to understand their words, even though each one pierced her already fragile composure. Dorothy's emotions were in turmoil, spiraling into a dark abyss of despair. How could they not be? It's not every day that a dedicated doctor faces dismissal because a patient dies under her care. The head of the department had unleashed a storm of fury, his voice echoing through the hospital corridors as he threatened her with legal action. His rage was uncontainable, a violent wave crashing over her already battered spirit. Even the chief physician, usually calm and composed, had delivered his verdict with a cold finality that left no room for hope. The harsh reality was clear: there was no escaping termination. But how can this be, Mr. Warren? I meticulously followed every protocol, and the medication was thoroughly vetted and proven safe. It can all be verified. Dorothy's voice trembled, her eyes welling up with tears she could barely contain. The chief physician simply shook his head, his expression a mask of indifference. I don't know what went wrong in your treatment, but the outcome is undeniable. You need to brace yourself for what's to come. The police will be here soon to take your statement, so think carefully before you speak. Don't say anything you might regret later. Now, head to the accounting office and finalize your departure. Numb with shock, Dorothy nodded and stumbled out of the office. All she wanted at that moment was to collapse into a corner and let the tears flow freely, to scream into the void that her life had become. The irony of the situation was almost unbearable. Today was the funeral of Scott Reynolds, her patient, though it had probably already concluded by the time she arrived. It didn't change the grim reality she faced. After collecting her severance pay and enduring yet another cold reprimand from the hospital administration, Dorothy headed straight to the cemetery, her heart heavy with sorrow and guilt. As a hematologist, she had been responsible for treating Scott's blood clotting disorder, but his death had come swiftly and without a clear explanation. The autopsy results remained a mystery to her, leaving a void where answers should have been. Who could she turn to for the truth? No one would defend her when the evidence pointed so clearly to her culpability. It was under her care that this successful businessman met his untimely end. Dorothy hailed a taxi for the one-way trip to the cemetery, purchasing a mourning wreath and a bouquet of carnations along the way. As the cemetery came into view, she spotted Scott Reynolds' grave from a distance. It was hard to miss a prominent site adorned with an abundance of wreaths, flowers, and a massive oak cross bearing his photograph and nameplate. Approaching the grave, Dorothy noticed two men dressed in black standing by the site. The funeral must have ended about an hour ago, but what were these men still doing here? Although she mentally chastised herself for asking such trivial questions, the answer was obvious. They were likely here for the same reason she was to pay their final respects to the departed. With a timid nod, Dorothy acknowledged the strangers and gently laid her flowers on the grave, then carefully placed the wreath to one side. She bowed her head, allowing herself a moment of silent mourning, her grief raw and unfiltered. As she stood there, she suddenly became aware of voices behind her. The two men were speaking in a language that wasn't native to her, but she quickly realized why their presence felt so out of place. They were foreigners. It wasn't that unusual, she supposed. They could have been business partners or international associates of the late Mr. Reynolds. What surprised her, however, was that she could partially understand their conversation. It was a language she had studied years ago, one in which she had excelled, winning competitions and accolades from her teacher. Against her better judgment, Dorothy began to pick out familiar words, but the content of their conversation filled her with a growing unease. What she overheard was far from ordinary and would soon turn her already shattered world completely upside down. "I wonder if this woman even knows the truth about the man she's mourning," sneered the first man, whose demeanor suggested he was the more influential of the two. "How could she? Just take a look at her, so ordinary," the second man laughed, his voice dripping with condescension. Dorothy felt a flush of shame and anger creeping up her neck. What nerve they had, coming to a sacred place like this and behaving as if they were at some sort of spectacle. Everything went off without a hitch, just as planned. "I have to say, it was quite impressive," the elder man remarked with an air of satisfaction. "Flawless execution," the younger man chimed in, correcting him with a smirk. Determined not to reveal that she understood every word of their language, Dorothy knelt before the grave, her heart heavy with grief and humiliation. The sharp scent of the carnations mixed with the damp earth filled her senses, causing her head to spin. As the men muttered their final words and made their way toward the exit, Dorothy couldn't resist casting them a scornful glance. As they departed, the elderly caretaker emerged from his small guardhouse, waving at Dorothy with a familiar warmth that only deepened her confusion. She hesitated, still trying to place where she had seen his face before, when suddenly an eerie sound reached her ears. What on earth was that? Dorothy gasped, her body tensing with a mix of fear and curiosity. At first, it sounded like a distant moan, but who could be moaning in a graveyard? Perhaps it was just one of the mourners still grappling with their loss. After all, this was a place steeped in sorrow. Dorothy scanned her surroundings but saw no one. Then, the moan echoed again, this time unmistakably coming from the ground beneath her feet. "Dear God, what's happening?" she whispered in horror, her breath catching in her throat. Ignoring the crumbling soil beneath the grave mound, she knelt, straining to listen more closely. It was undeniable the sound was coming from deep within the earth, from the grave itself. For a moment, Dorothy wondered if her mind was playing tricks on her, twisted by the weight of her sorrow. But then, the moan came again, this time filled with such pain and desperation that it sent shivers down her spine. Panic surged through Dorothy as the realization hit her. She sprang to her feet and dashed toward the caretaker's guardhouse, her voice trembling with urgency. "Help me, please," she cried, banging on the door with all the force she could muster. "I need your help right now." The door creaked open, revealing the slender, elderly caretaker, his weary face etched with years of hardship. He wore worn-out boots and a faded jacket that had seen better days. "What's the matter, miss?" he asked, his voice gravelly and tinged with concern. "I heard a moan." "Over there," Dorothy blurted out, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. "It's coming from a freshly dug grave." The caretaker, who had long grown accustomed to the strange tales that often accompanied his job, would have usually dismissed such claims. But there was something in Dorothy's eyes, something desperate, and sincere that stirred his curiosity. With a resigned sigh, he agreed to accompany her, grabbing a shovel and a flashlight as the evening shadows began to lengthen. "Show me where you heard it," he said, scanning the graveyard with a wary eye. As they walked, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unsettlingly familiar about the caretaker's voice. Where had she heard it before? And why did he seem to be scrutinizing her as they moved toward Scott's grave? Once they reached the grave, Dorothy pointed with trembling hands. "Here. I heard the moan coming from here." The caretaker knelt beside the grave, pressing his ear to the ground, his face paling as the same realization dawned on him. Without a word, he began digging frantically, his aged hands moving with surprising speed and determination. Despite his years, he worked with the vigor of a much younger man, each shovelful of earth thrown aside with a sense of urgency. Dorothy, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, grabbed a smaller shovel left behind by the gravediggers and joined in. Together they labored in silence, save for the unsettling sounds that continued to emanate from below. After what felt like an eternity, they finally unearthed the coffin. The lacquered lid had splintered, revealing the grim reality within. "It seems the funeral home deceived the family again," the caretaker murmured bitterly. They used a defective lid and masked it with a glossy finish. His voice, now more familiar than ever, sent a jolt of recognition through Dorothy. But there was no time to dwell on it as the caretaker jumped into the grave, prying open the lid with a strength that belied his frail appearance. "Scott, is that you?" Dorothy whispered in a trembling voice, her mind bracing for the worst as she peered into the darkness. But instead of the familiar face of her former patient, her eyes met the gaunt, ashen face of a stranger. The man inside the coffin was dressed in tattered, worn-out clothes, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes barely open. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead, and his cracked lips moved, forming silent pleas for help. "Oh my God," the caretaker gasped, his eyes widening in horror. "He's alive." As the man lying in the coffin slowly opened his eyes, confusion and fear were etched across his pale face. With a feeble effort, he propped himself up on his elbows and scanned his surroundings, his gaze darting anxiously. "Where am I?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper as he gripped the edges of the coffin in desperation. "Am I really in a grave? Or have I crossed over to the other side? Is this what death feels like?" Dorothy's heart skipped a beat, her concern deepening by the second. "We need to call an ambulance immediately," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "He's in a state of shock, and besides, this isn't Scott Reynolds." The caretaker, visibly startled, extended his hand to help the man out of the grave. The stranger's face was a mask of terror as he tried to make sense of the situation, his voice trembling with anxiety. "I don't know how I ended up here," he stammered. "I was offered a temporary job. I went for an interview, but after that, everything was a blur. My head, it's pounding and spinning." "Who are you?" the caretaker asked, his concern barely contained as he sought to understand the unfolding mystery. "What's your name?" "Ethan," the man replied, his voice shaky. Ethan Parks. Dorothy and the caretaker exchanged looks of disbelief. The situation was beyond comprehension. The grave meant to hold the body of businessman Scott Reynolds was occupied by an entirely different, very much alive person. It was as if the world had slipped into some surreal nightmare. "How did you end up here?" Dorothy pressed, trying to piece together the puzzle. "Did you know the deceased?" "No," Ethan responded, shaking his head weakly. "I've never heard that name before. Wait, it's coming back to me now. They asked me to fill in for the gravediggers on the funeral team. I needed the money, so I agreed. The last thing I remember is standing beside a closed coffin, ready for the burial. But after that, nothing. What's happening to me? I just can't make sense of it." Dorothy felt a knot of unease tightening in her chest as she turned to the caretaker, who had switched on a flashlight, casting an eerie glow over the area. At that moment, a distant memory clicked into place. Dorothy's eyes widened as she recognized the man before her. "Mr. Cobb," she whispered in disbelief. "You were my high school foreign language teacher. Is it you?" The caretaker smiled softly, a hint of melancholy in his eyes. "So you finally remembered me, Dorothy. I recognized you right away. You've hardly changed, but as you can see, time hasn't been as kind to me. I was a teacher once, and now. Well, now I'm a caretaker here in this cemetery." Tears welled up in Dorothy's eyes. Mr. Cobb had been one of her favorite teachers, a guiding light in her youth. He had ignited her passion for languages and had always believed in her, helping her become one of the top students in her class. "I knew your face was familiar, but I couldn't place it at first," Dorothy admitted, a pang of guilt washing over her. The caretaker waved it off with a dismissive gesture. "Don't worry about it. That was a long time ago. What matters now is helping this poor man. I've never encountered anything like this in all my years." Meanwhile, Ethan, still visibly shaken, began pacing back and forth near the grave, his mind overwhelmed by the bizarre turn of events. Sensing his distress, Dorothy gently took his hand, hoping to offer some comfort. "Don't worry, we'll figure this out. We need to get you checked out by a doctor, make sure you're okay." Ethan looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. "No ambulance, please, and no police. I don't want to get involved with law enforcement. I don't even know what's happening, and for all I know, I could be caught up in something terrible." The caretaker, sensing Ethan's rising panic, offered a practical solution. "Why don't you come with me? You can rest at my place until we figure this out." He led Ethan back to his small, modest lodge, where he offered him water and a place to lie down. "Stay here and try to relax. I'll take care of the grave. Whoever did this wanted it to remain hidden. We should probably keep it that way, at least for now." Ethan nodded wearily, but his eyes were still clouded with confusion. Meanwhile, Dorothy returned to the grave, her mind racing with questions. She took out her phone and snapped several photos, documenting the disturbed grave, the cracked coffin lid, and everything associated with Scott Reynolds: the cross, the plaque, the wreaths bearing somber inscriptions. With Mr. Cobb's help, they painstakingly restored the grave to its original state, making sure nothing appeared out of the ordinary. As they worked, Dorothy couldn't help but reflect on the twists and turns her life had taken since leaving high school. "After graduating from medical school, I started working at the clinic. I'm sorry I never kept in touch, Mr. Cobb. After we finished school, everyone just drifted apart," she said, her voice tinged with regret. Mr. Cobb nodded, a sadness in his eyes that went beyond their lost connection. "I often wondered what became of you. You were one of my brightest students. I always knew you'd go on to do great things, whether as a translator or a doctor. I'm proud of you, Dorothy." When the grave was finally restored, they sat down at a nearby table, the encroaching dusk casting long shadows over the cemetery. Dorothy felt no fear, despite the eerie surroundings. Instead, she was comforted by Mr. Cobb's presence, as if their shared past had woven an invisible thread between them, reconnecting them in this unexpected moment. Mr. Cobb shared his story, one that was marked by sorrow and loss. He told her about his only son, who had died in a tragic car accident several years ago. After his son's death, Mr. Cobb's daughter-in-law had turned on him, forcing him out of their home and cutting off all contact with his grandchildren. Now, he lived a lonely life in the caretaker's lodge, isolated from the family he loved. Dorothy listened, her heart heavy with empathy. "How could she do that to you?" she asked, her voice barely hiding her anger. "Why would she treat her own family this way?" "I think she's afraid I'll take her children away, Mr. Cobb replied, his voice tinged with bitterness. Dorothy suddenly realized that his daughter-in-law was likely acting out of fear and insecurity, trying to protect her fragile world. But that didn't excuse her cruelty. "You have to fight for your rights, mister," Dorothy said with determination. "Your grandchildren deserve to know their grandfather, and you deserve to see them. It's not just your right, it's theirs too." "Mister." Cobb sighed deeply. "It's not that simple, Dorothy. I don't have the money for a lawyer, at least not one who could stand a chance in court. The ones I can afford are only interested in lining their pockets." "Don't worry," Dorothy said, her voice resolute. "I'll help you. I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way. You've helped me so much, Mr. Cobb. I owe you everything." "You don't owe me a thing, mister," Cobb replied with a gentle smile. "You were always my favorite student. It's enough for me to see that you're doing well." Overcome with emotion, Dorothy embraced her old teacher, feeling a deep bond that transcended the years and the darkness that surrounded them. As the night closed in, they returned to Mr. Cobb's lodge, where he brewed them a pot of fragrant tea. The warmth of the tea and the light of the small lantern made the strange events of the evening seem almost distant. Mr. Cobb shared a few amusing stories from his past, which brought a rare smile to Dorothy's face, momentarily lifting the weight of her worries. Ethan, however, remained silent, lost in thought. He still couldn't comprehend what had happened, why he had been placed in a grave, or why his head ached so much. And above all, he couldn't stop wondering where was Scott Reynolds, what had happened. As the memory of the unsettling encounter with the men resurfaced, Dorothy decided to share it with her former teacher. She recounted the strange phrases she had overheard, translating them into the language she had mastered under Mr. Cobb's guidance. The elderly caretaker, visibly impressed by her translation skills, offered her a warm smile, but then his expression grew pensive. The day's events had crossed the line into the bizarre, leaving both of them with more questions than answers. Time seemed to slip away unnoticed, and before long, Dorothy realized it was getting late. She had planned to call a taxi and head home, but something held her back. The thought of leaving Ethan alone in the caretaker's lodge didn't sit well with her. "Ethan," she asked gently, "do you have anywhere to go? A place where you can rest and recover?" Ethan hesitated, his uncertainty evident. "Not really," he admitted. "I came to the city from the provinces looking for work, but I ended up getting scammed. They didn't pay me, took my passport, and even threatened to throw me into the river if I caused any trouble. I haven't been back home in 5 years. I had a falling out with my parents when I left. So I've been too ashamed to return." "You shouldn't have turned your back on your parents, young man, mister," Cobb gently admonished. "They brought you into this world after all." Ethan nodded, his expression tinged with regret. "I know. It's just, I didn't want to go back as a failure. I had big plans, wanted to get married after I joined the army. But my fiancée didn't wait for me. She married the local farmer's son instead. I can't blame her. Though, he's got more money than I ever did. 6 months before I was supposed to come home, Emily sent me a letter. She wrote, 'I'm getting married. Don't judge me too harshly.' Easy for her to say. I nearly threw myself into the river after reading that. If it wasn't for my buddy who tied me up to stop me, I might have done it. It was hard, but I got through it. When I finally got back, she had already given birth to a baby boy. A beautiful kid. It made me so jealous that I decided to leave the village and come to the city, thinking I could change my life, prove I wasn't a loser." Mr. Cobb and Dorothy exchanged a knowing glance, understanding the depth of Ethan's struggles. Dorothy then asked, "So what will you do now, Ethan? Are you coming with me? The taxi is already on its way. I just got a call from the dispatcher." Ethan shook his head, determination flickering in his eyes. "No, I'll stay here with Mr. Cobb. I need some time to recover, and who knows, maybe I'll find some work around here. There's always something to do at a cemetery. At least I won't starve." The elderly caretaker's face brightened at the prospect of having company. "Of course, stay here, son. It'll be nice to have someone around. Beat spending nights alone with nothing but the crosses and graves for company." Dorothy smiled warmly as she opened the lodge door, noticing the taxi waiting by the gate, its headlights flashing in the dim light. "All right then. I've written my phone number on a piece of paper and left it on the table. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. I'll also try to look into what's been happening. I'll visit again in a few days, so please be careful in the meantime." "Thank you, Dorothy, mister," Cobb said, embracing her with genuine affection. As Dorothy made her way to the gate, she turned back to wave at Mr. Cobb and Ethan, who waved back with warm smiles. As she walked towards the waiting taxi, she felt a deep sense of gratitude and love for Mr. Cobb, a man who had once been her teacher, and who now, after all these years, had become a trusted friend and mentor. As she approached the taxi, a small emblem on the windshield caught her eye, sparking a wave of unexpected empathy. The driver was disabled. After giving him the address, Dorothy leaned back into the seat, feeling a profound exhaustion settle over her. The driver nodded in acknowledgement and smoothly pulled away from the cemetery. The streets, cloaked in a thick night fog, sped past the windows as Dorothy, utterly drained, yearned for nothing more than a hot bath and the comfort of her bed. The car's interior was bathed in a soft, soothing glow from the dashboard, casting gentle shadows that danced across the seats. To pass the time, Dorothy focused on the rhythmic hum of the tires against the road, her gaze drifting out the window, where the silhouettes of tall buildings loomed in the darkness. In that quiet, dimly lit space, Dorothy felt completely spent, as if the events of the day had drained her of every last ounce of energy. She closed her eyes, the weight of the world pressing down on her, as she longed for the solace of sleep to take her away from the strange and unsettling reality she had just experienced. The driver sat in silence, focused on the road ahead. Dorothy, glancing at him, noticed that he was indeed a double amputee, and it dawned on her that outside the car, he likely relied on a wheelchair for mobility. His vehicle was fitted with a special mechanism, enabling him to drive using only his hands. The setup was both practical and a testament to his resilience. "I'm sorry," Dorothy suddenly blurted out, breaking the silence. "I guess I'm not the most engaging passenger, always so quiet." The driver responded with a warm smile, one that was genuine and not just out of courtesy. "No need to apologize," he said. "Are you feeling a bit down? Is everything all right?" Dorothy hesitated before nodding, uncertain. "Well, how do I put it? I lost my job today, and I spent a good part of the evening at a cemetery. It's been one of those days." Eric, the taxi driver, didn't press further. Instead, he turned on some soft, soothing music, which filled the car with a comforting ambience. "I'm Eric, by the way," he said, glancing over at her. "And you are?" "Dorothy," she replied, feeling a bit more at ease. "It's just been an exhausting day, though I suppose that's not too surprising given my line of work." "Are you a doctor?" Eric asked, surprising Dorothy with his perceptiveness. She raised her eyebrows, caught off guard by his quick deduction. "Yes, I am," she confirmed. "How did you know?" Eric's smile widened slightly. "Your hands are well taken care of, and you don't have much of a tan, which tells me you spend a lot of time indoors. Plus, there's a faint scent of medication lingering on your clothes. It's pretty straightforward." Dorothy chuckled softly, feeling a little awkward. "I suppose I could be a nurse or a medical assistant. Why did you assume I was specifically a doctor?" Eric shifted gears and shrugged casually. "Just a hunch, I guess. There's something about your gaze that's confident but tired. It's the kind of look you see in people who carry a certain amount of responsibility, who are used to making tough decisions." "And you?" Dorothy asked cautiously, curious but also wary of overstepping. "What did you do before?" "Well, before I lost my legs," Eric finished for her, his tone even. He paused for a moment, then continued. "I was with the police. There was an operation to arrest a particularly dangerous criminal. Things went sideways." His voice trailed off, and Dorothy could sense the pain behind his words. It wasn't just the physical loss that weighed on him, but the memories of a life that had been irrevocably changed. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I didn't mean to bring up something painful." Eric gave a small nod, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Maybe," he said softly. "But you can't change the past." "I don't regret what happened, though. It led me to where I am now, helping people differently. 7 years ago, during that operation, the criminal we were after turned out to be an old classmate of mine. I had some pity for him, but he didn't feel the same. He rammed my patrol car and took off down the highway. They caught him later, but it took over an hour to cut me out of the wreckage." Dorothy felt a pang of empathy for Eric. His story was one of sacrifice and courage, yet it also carried the weight of betrayal and loss. "That must have been incredibly difficult," she said, her voice tinged with respect. "It was," Eric admitted. "But I've come to terms with it. You can't dwell on what's lost, you have to focus on what's ahead. Life doesn't stop just because things didn't go as planned." Dorothy nodded, absorbing his words. They drove on in silence for a few moments, the gentle hum of the engine and the soft music creating a cocoon of calm within the car. The night fog outside blurred the city lights, making the world seem distant and surreal. Dorothy leaned back in her seat, feeling the exhaustion of the day weigh down on her. Yet somehow Eric's words had given her a sense of clarity. As they approached her destination, she couldn't help but feel a deep respect for this man who had faced unimaginable challenges and come out the other side with his spirit intact. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Eric," she said as they pulled up to her building. "You've given me a lot to think about." Eric smiled again, this time with a touch of warmth that reached his eyes. "Anytime, Dorothy. Take care of yourself." With that, Dorothy stepped out of the taxi, watching as Eric drove off into the night. As she stood there, the cool night air brushing against her face, she felt a strange mix of weariness and resolve. Today had been a tough day, no doubt, but hearing Eric's story reminded her that even in the face of adversity, there was always a way forward. Dorothy looked at the driver with newfound respect. "You're a remarkably strong person, Eric. I have no doubt your life holds great meaning. Just keep being yourself and never give up." Eric nodded with determination as he brought the car to a stop in front of her building. "I won't give up, Dorothy. I'm saving up for prosthetics, and once I have them, I'm going to join a sports club and compete in the events they hold for people with disabilities." Dorothy smiled warmly, her heart feeling lighter despite the day's turmoil. "Goodbye, Eric," she said as she stepped out of the car. "Thank you for the ride. Keep the change. It's my small contribution to helping you reach your dream." "Goodbye," he replied with a genuine smile. "Take care, and here, take my business card. You never know when you might need it." Dorothy accepted the card and tucked it into her purse, then took a deep breath of the cool night air as she walked toward her apartment building. All she could think about now was collapsing into bed, but not before a long, hot bath to wash away the day's stress. Since her divorce, Dorothy had been living in a modest one-bedroom apartment. Her husband, Brian, had taken the spacious 4-bedroom apartment they'd purchased together in a luxury district, leaving her with just enough to buy this small place. It felt like a bone thrown at a starving dog. Brian had considered it a fair deal, and the lawyers he hired had manipulated the situation so that Dorothy couldn't prove her financial contribution to the purchase of their former home. But at that time, family disputes had been the least of her worries. Just a month before the divorce, Dorothy had miscarried yet again. The loss had devastated her, and in her darkest moments, she had wondered if the baby might have been the key to saving her marriage. But fate had its cruel plans, and she was completely blindsided by the divorce. How could she have known that Brian had been having an affair with his secretary, Ruby, for years? That leggy, glamorous woman hadn't wasted any time. She'd promptly gotten pregnant by Brian. Dorothy didn't harbor any resentment toward Ruby, though. If she could carry a child for Brian, then so be it, especially if he was so insistent on having an heir. When Dorothy heard about the baby on the way, she bought several sets of baby clothes and had them sent to Brian and Ruby's home. It was an act of pure kindness, a final gesture of goodwill. She never received a thank you, but she didn't expect one. Let them live their lives. Without her, she would survive and move on. After her bath, Dorothy didn't bother with dinner. She was too exhausted to even think about food. As soon as her head hit the pillow, she was out cold, the weight of the day finally catching up with her. But her sleep was anything but peaceful. The stress of losing her job, the result of a patient's sudden death shortly after discharge, had followed her into her dreams. And then there was the haunting memory of the cemetery visit, where she had gone to seek forgiveness from the deceased, only to find a living man in the grave instead. Her sleep was restless, punctuated by vivid nightmares. She woke repeatedly, drenched in cold sweat, each time haunted by the image of that cracked coffin lid and the muffled moans from within. What if they hadn't reached Mr. Cobb's lodge in time? What if Ethan had suffocated in that coffin, trapped beneath the earth with no way out? The thoughts gnawed at her, leaving her shaken and unable to find peace. Despite her exhaustion, Dorothy found no solace in sleep. She dreamt of hospital corridors filled with patients, their faces pleading for her help, and of foreign words written in a Gothic script, strange and ominous. Those men at the cemetery, who were they, and why had they behaved so provocatively? She had no answers, just as she had no idea what had become of Scott Reynolds. Waking once more in the dead of night, the images still fresh in her mind, Dorothy tried to make sense of it all, to piece together the events of the day. But the more she thought about it, the more elusive the truth seemed. Dorothy wasn't an atheist. She believed in something greater than herself, something beyond human understanding. But what had happened at the cemetery, there was no other word for it but miraculous. As she lay in the dark, her mind racing, she felt as though she was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a mystery that defied explanation. All she could do was wait for the dawn and hope that, in the light of day, the answers would become clearer. Scott Reynolds' face, the enigmatic patient from the hematology department, resurfaced in Dorothy's memory with unnerving clarity. He was a businessman, ostensibly from the upper echelons of society, and his appearance seemed almost too perfect for a patient at a city clinic. From the moment he was admitted, Dorothy, seasoned by years of medical experience, had a gnawing feeling that something wasn't quite right. His symptoms were peculiar and inconsistent: headaches, abdominal spasms, and shortness of breath. Such symptoms usually pointed to something serious, yet every test and examination returned results that suggested he was, for all intents and purposes, healthy, or at least conditionally healthy. As any doctor knows, with enough scrutiny, something can always be found to treat, but Scott's case was perplexing. The more time Dorothy spent observing him, the stronger her suspicions grew. Scott's demeanor and his frequent mentions of a mysterious blood clotting disorder supposedly inherited from his male ancestors seemed almost theatrical. He spun tales of a hereditary curse, claiming that both his father and grandfather had suffered from the same condition. But Dorothy wasn't convinced. There were minor discrepancies in his story, and none of his so-called symptoms seemed severe enough to justify hospitalization. The expensive suit he wore, the exclusive cologne he favored, and the top-tier smartphone he always had on hand, none of these fit the image of a man on the brink of death. driven by a mix of professional curiosity and an ethical obligation to her patients. Dorothy began a quiet investigation of her own. It wasn't a dramatic, high-stakes probe like in a mystery novel, but rather a simple inquiry made possible through her extensive network of colleagues and acquaintances in the medical field. Through discreet conversations and casual inquiries, she pieced together a troubling narrative. Scott was deeply in debt to some very dangerous people. His sudden illness seemed less like a genuine health crisis and more like a desperate attempt to evade his creditors. Dorothy found herself wrestling with a moral quandary. Should she report her suspicions to the hospital management? The department head had personally ensured that Scott was given a private, luxurious room equipped with a TV and air conditioning, a clear sign that he was no ordinary patient. On one hand, there was the risk of angering powerful people by exposing Scott's deceit. On the other, Scott was taking advantage of the hospital's resources, diverting attention away from patients who genuinely needed care. Dorothy's sense of duty won out. One evening, during her rounds, she confronted Scott directly. Standing at the foot of his bed, her voice calm but her eyes blazing, she said, "Scott, I know you're lying about your illness." The effect of her words was immediate. Scott's confident facade crumbled, replaced by a look of panic and fear. The color drained from his face, and his eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. At that moment, Dorothy knew she had cornered him. His act was over. The very next day, after Dorothy reported her findings to the hospital administration, Scott was discharged, his miraculous recovery nothing more than a convenient excuse to rid the hospital of a fraudster. Dorothy felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had exposed a charlatan, protected the reputation of her hospital, and ensured that resources would be available for those who truly needed them. But satisfaction was short-lived. Not long after his discharge, the news of Scott's sudden death spread through the hospital like wildfire. The blame was swift and brutal. According to the department head and the chief physician, the fault lay squarely on Dorothy's shoulders. She had been accused of discharging the patient too soon, allegedly setting off a chain of irreversible processes in his body. It didn't matter that Scott had manipulated everyone around him before his death, or that his so-called illness was nothing but a ruse. In the eyes of the hospital and the whispered rumors among her colleagues, Dorothy Briggs was the scapegoat. She tried to defend herself, to make the administration see reason, but her protests fell on deaf ears. Instead of recognizing the fraud Scott had perpetrated, they condemned Dorothy for what they called premature discharge, claiming it had led to the businessman's death. "Oh, for heaven's sake, what processes!" Dorothy had exclaimed in frustration during one of her final meetings with the hospital management. He was as healthy as a bull. They were bringing him gourmet meals 3 times a day. How could a seriously ill man have such an appetite? But Mr. Warren, the chief physician, was unmoved. He merely shook his head, his expression one of cold indifference. "That's none of your concern anymore, Briggs. Just pray this doesn't go to court, or you might lose your medical license for good. If that happens, maybe I could find you a job as a janitor after all. You're not a stranger. But don't expect anything more." Dorothy left that meeting feeling utterly defeated. Not only had she lost her job, but her reputation and career were now in jeopardy. All because she had dared to do the right thing. The irony was bitter. She had exposed a fraud, yet she was the one paying the price. And as she lay awake that night, haunted by the memories of Scott's cunning smile and the tragic twist of fate that had led to his death, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that she had somehow missed something crucial, some detail that could have changed everything. But what was it? And where had Scott Reynolds truly disappeared to in those final moments before his death? The questions loomed large in her mind, casting a shadow over her every thought. "But I have nothing except the bun," the boy cried, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and sadness. "Mr. Cobb looked at the boy, his heart heavy with a deep, unspoken sympathy. Then leave the bun, he said softly. Your mom already knows how much you love her. The boy hesitated for a moment, then reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out a small, slightly crumpled bun. He turned it over in his hands, as if it were a precious treasure, before pressing it gently against his chest. Seeing this, Mr. Cobb realized that the boy understood the true value of bread, of food, of the simplest things in life. Can I leave it on the grave myself? The boy asked, his eyes searching Mr. Cobb's for permission. Of course, Mr. Cobb replied, his voice gentle and reassuring. The boy nodded and walked over to the grave, placing the bun at the foot of the cross. He then leaned in close to the faded photograph of his mother, kissing it tenderly. Kneeling, he whispered, "Mommy, I love you very much." As Mr. Cobb watched this poignant scene unfold, he felt a deep sense of pity for the little soul standing before him, a child so tragically deprived of a mother's love and affection. "What's your name, buddy, Mr.?" Cobb asked gently when the boy finally stood up, wiping away tears with the sleeve of his worn-out sweater. "Nicholas," the boy replied, his voice small and weary. "Come here, Nicholas, Mr." Cobb said, rising from his knees and extending a hand. "I'll take you home." Nicholas walked over to Mr. Cobb, and the caretaker took the boy's small, cold hand in his own. "Where were you going, anyway, Mr.?" Cobb asked, concerned. Nicholas looked down at his feet, uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "I live with my stepfather, but he's been drinking again. I don't have anyone else." "Mr." Cobb squeezed the boy's hand gently. "Don't worry," he said with a kind smile. "You won't be alone. You can stay with me, Ethan, for now, all right? We'll take care of you." Nicholas nodded, holding on to Mr. Cobb's hand as they began to walk away from the grave. He glanced back over his shoulder at his mother's final resting place and whispered, "Mommy, don't miss me. I'll come visit more often." "Your mom will never forget you, Mr." Cobb assured him. "She'll always be with you in your heart." As they made their way back to the guardhouse, Ethan greeted them with a look of surprise. "Who's this?" he asked, noticing the young boy at Mr. Cobb's side. "This is Nicholas, Mr." Cobb explained, introducing the boy. "He's got nowhere to go." Ethan knelt to meet Nicholas's gaze, immediately noticing the sadness that lingered in the boy's eyes. "Don't worry," Ethan said, offering a reassuring smile. "We're here for you now. We won't leave you." "Thank you," Nicholas whispered, managing a small smile for the first time since they met. Mr. Cobb, moved by the moment, felt a tear slip down his cheek. His life, once filled with loneliness and sorrow, had recently taken a turn for the better. Now, he had 2 new friends, and the sense of purpose he had thought long lost was slowly returning. After preparing a simple breakfast of sandwiches for Nicholas, Mr. Cobb turned on the old radio, letting the soft murmur of the news fill the cozy guardhouse. Meanwhile, across town, Dorothy sat in her kitchen, nursing a strong cup of coffee. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and uncertainties. What should she do next? Should she go to the police? But what could she possibly say? That she had heard moans coming from a grave, or that she had unearthed a coffin only to find a man inside who wasn't supposed to be there. And what about Ethan, who had specifically asked her not to involve the authorities? Her thoughts circled back to Eric, the former police officer turned taxi driver. Perhaps he could help. Surely he still had some connections, some way to make sense of this bizarre situation. Taking out the business card Eric had given her, Dorothy dialed his number. The phone barely rang before it was answered. It seemed as though Eric had been expecting her call. After she haltingly explained the strange events that had unfolded, Eric listened intently, his tone calm and steady. "Wait for me at the square in front of your house," he said after a moment of thought. "I'll be there soon." His confidence was palpable, which gave Dorothy a small measure of comfort. When Eric arrived, he listened to Dorothy's story without interrupting, his gaze focused, absorbing every detail. There was a flicker of understanding in his eyes, something that suggested he had seen this kind of darkness before. "This Scott Reynolds," he began, "he's rich, isn't he?" Dorothy nodded. "Yes, a wealthy businessman. His name has come up in a few scandals. And now, it seems like someone tried to bury someone else in his place. I don't know if you can help, Eric, but I had to tell someone." Eric regarded her silently for a moment, then shook his head, sensing the weight of her worry. "I'll see what I can find out about Scott," he said finally. His words caught Dorothy off guard, her voice faltering as she asked, "Are you sure? This might be dangerous." "In life, there are no guarantees," Eric replied, standing up and adjusting his uncomfortable prosthesis. He had always struggled with trusting people, but there was something about Dorothy. She saw him as a person, not just as a man with limitations. "I'll do my best to find him," he reassured her. "But I have a feeling this isn't going to end well." Dorothy nodded, hope and fear mingling in her eyes. "Thank you, Eric," she said as he left. Eric drove home, his mind already working through the details of the case. He needed to gather as much information about Scott as possible, and for that he needed access to his old apartment downtown. It had once served as a makeshift headquarters for the detective agency he and his friend Vincent had run. Eric, unable to physically pursue leads, had been the brains behind the operation, while Vincent handled the legwork, gathering information and tailing suspects. "Vinny, I need your help, buddy," Eric said when Vincent answered the phone. "Eric, good to hear from you." Vincent's voice was warm and familiar. "What's going on? Did the world end or what?" After weighing his words carefully, Eric told Vincent about Dorothy and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Scott Reynolds. "Sounds like we've got ourselves a case," Vincent said after a moment of silence. "I'm in. Let's see what we can dig up." "Listen, you know I quit the detective business," Vincent said, his tone serious but with a hint of resignation. "But it seems I can't refuse you. What do you know about this Scott?" Eric breathed a sigh of relief. Vincent's agreement was the first piece of good news he'd had in days. He quickly shared everything Dorothy had told him about Scott Reynolds, the mysterious symptoms, the fake illness, the sudden death, and the eerie discovery at the cemetery. "This is getting interesting," Vincent mused. "I've got some contacts in the criminal underworld. They might be able to help us figure out where Scott disappeared to." "I hope we can find something," Eric replied, a sense of determination settling over him. After their conversation, Eric felt more confident, bolstered by the knowledge that Vincent was on board. As he rummaged through his old belongings, he found a notebook with the phone numbers of his former informants. One name in particular stood out. "Hey, old man," Eric began when his informant answered the phone. "Still in the business? I've got a job for you." Yeah, consider it repayment for that debt you never returned. No hard feelings, right? So tell me, do you know anything about what happened to businessman Scott Reynolds?" There was a brief pause on the other end, a hesitation that told Eric the man knew something. "I'll do what I can," the informant finally promised, even if it means doing the impossible with that. Eric had cast his net into the murky waters of the criminal underworld. Now all he could do was wait. Weeks passed, each day blending into the next. During that time, Dorothy and Eric grew closer, their bond strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. Dorothy visited Ethan and Mr. Cobb at the cemetery several times and even met little Nicholas, the orphaned boy Mr. Cobb had taken under his care. Nicholas's tragic story touched Dorothy deeply, and she found herself wanting to help him in any way she could. "Maybe I should adopt him," Dorothy thought to herself, tears welling up as she watched the boy play. "He's such a sweet child, and with my life as it is, can I even have a child of my own? Time is running out. Nicholas could be the son I've always dreamed of." When she brought up the idea with Mr. Cobb, she saw immediate approval in his eyes. "That's a wonderful idea," he said warmly. "Nicholas is a good boy. Mark my words, he won't disappoint you. I've spent a lot of time with him, and I'm certain he's got a bright future ahead. He just needs the right guidance." Dorothy smiled, her heart swelling with affection for the little boy. Meanwhile, Eric was neck deep in his investigation. He combed through every bit of information he could find about Scott, meeting with Vincent regularly. Vincent passed along contacts in the underworld who might help track down the elusive businessman. "Be careful," Vincent warned during one of their meetings. "These guys don't like too many questions." Eric thanked him and went to meet one of the contacts, a businessman with ties to the city's criminal elements. The meeting took place in a rundown office in one of the city's most dangerous neighborhoods. The man listened patiently to Eric's story, his expression unreadable. When Eric finished, the man leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. "You want to know what happened to Scott Reynolds?" the man finally asked, his tone almost mocking. "It's pretty straightforward. This scoundrel ran away from his creditors, owed them a mountain of money. Serious people offered to help him escape abroad. He had no other choice, so he staged his funeral and vanished." Eric's heart sank. "And that's all there is to it?" he asked, hoping for more. The man smirked. "What, not enough for you? Fine, I'll give you a bit more. Scotty Reynolds didn't just run abroad. His father, who's loaded, was over there. The old man had to flee the country in the late 90s because of some nasty business with his competitors. Left his 1-year-old son Scott behind in an orphanage. His wife had died in a car crash, and he had no choice. Found his son a quarter of a century later. Imagine that. So, he sent a team to get Scott. They staged the funeral, the fake coffin, the whole charade." Eric was stunned, barely able to keep his balance on his prosthesis. "Where is Scott now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The man laughed, a harsh, cold sound. "Do you think I'd tell you that? His location is a well-guarded secret. I suggest you forget about him. He's not worth risking your life for." Disappointment washed over Eric as he realized he'd hit a dead end. "Thanks anyway," he muttered, turning to leave. "Don't mention it," the man called after him, his tone dripping with insincerity. "But my advice? Walk away from this. It's not worth it." Eric returned home, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had uncovered the truth about Scott's past, but it brought no comfort, only frustration. That evening, he called Dorothy and told her everything he had learned. Her reaction was one of shock and despair. With Scott fleeing abroad, all hope of clearing her name seemed to vanish. To the world, she was still just a failed doctor, a scapegoat for a man who had fooled everyone. Her career in medicine was effectively over. The most she could hope for now was a lowly nursing position, far removed from the life she had once known. As she listened to Eric's voice on the other end of the line, Dorothy felt a deep sense of loss, as if the last threads of her former life were slipping through her fingers. "Thank you, Eric," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for trying." "I wish I could have done more," Eric replied, his voice heavy with regret. "But I'm here if you need anything. We'll get through this, Dorothy. One way or another, we'll find a way." As they ended the call, both Dorothy and Eric were left with a lingering sense of unfinished business, knowing that the fight for truth and justice was far from over. But for now, all they could do was wait and hope that somewhere, somehow, a new path would open up for them. Dorothy couldn't believe how everything had spiraled out of control. She had spent years studying, completing her internship, and dedicating herself to her medical career, only to see it all crumble because of an elusive businessman's deceitful actions. Scott Reynolds had manipulated the system, staged his death, and then slipped away to a life of luxury abroad with his wealthy father. The thought of it made her stomach turn. How could such an injustice be allowed to happen? And what about Ethan? He had suffered, almost losing his life, trapped in a coffin, all because of Scott's twisted scheme. Who would pay for Ethan's medical treatment if complications arose from his head injury? No one. Ethan was a homeless man, forgotten by society, with no one to stand up for him. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on Dorothy, threatening to pull her into a deep depression. But then there was Nicholas, the little boy who had lost his mother and who now needed someone to care for him. "No, I can't give up," Dorothy whispered to herself as if chanting a mantra. "I'll get all the documents sorted, become his guardian, and then we'll see who wins." It took her a month of navigating the bureaucratic maze, gathering the necessary paperwork, and preparing her case for court. The process was grueling, but Dorothy was fueled by a fierce determination to protect Nicholas. The boy's stepfather, Lucas, a known alcoholic, had refused to give him up without a fight. He pretended to be a caring father, but Dorothy knew the truth. She had seen the effects of Lucas's neglect, the way Nicholas was left to fend for himself while his stepfather drowned in alcohol. The day of the court hearing finally arrived, and Dorothy felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting a warm glow on the documents spread out before her. She rubbed her tired eyes, but her focus never wavered. This was too important. Nicholas's future depended on the outcome of this day. She knew she had to fight for him, to prove to the court that she was the best guardian for this vulnerable child. Dorothy had met Nicholas in Mr. Cobb's small, cozy guardhouse at the cemetery. The boy had been visiting his mother's grave, and Dorothy had been struck by his quiet, somber demeanor. As she got to know him, she learned of his mother's illness and how Lucas's drinking left Nicholas to care for himself. She couldn't stand the thought of this child being left in such an unstable environment. In court, Lucas put on a show, spouting sentimental phrases about his love for his stepson and how he would never harm Nicholas, even when drunk. But Dorothy knew better. She had seen the broken toys and heard the frightened whispers that told a very different story. She also knew that the evidence was slim, that the system was not always just, and that Lucas's words might carry weight. But Dorothy had something more powerful than evidence. She had love and a deep, genuine desire to give Nicholas a better life. She spoke in court about her love for children, her dream of building a happy family, and how she wanted to provide Nicholas with the opportunities he deserved. Her words came from the heart, filled with sincerity and hope. Lucas, on the other hand, couldn't hide his true nature. His greedy, malicious intent was clear to anyone who paid attention. He hurled insults at Dorothy, accusing her of trying to steal his son for selfish reasons. He argued that guardianship would restrict Nicholas's freedom and that the boy wouldn't be happy with Dorothy. But his arguments lacked substance, and his anger only highlighted his unfitness as a guardian. The judge, seeing through the charade, recognized Dorothy's sincerity and kindness. In the end, Lucas's guardianship rights were revoked, and Nicholas was entrusted to Dorothy Briggs. The moment the ruling was announced, a wave of relief and joy washed over Dorothy. She had done it. She had fought for Nicholas and won. That same day, she took Nicholas home. They celebrated by buying new toys and cooking his favorite meal, macaroni and cheese with meatballs. The once quiet apartment was now filled with laughter and warmth. Nicholas, feeling safe and loved, began calling Dorothy Mom. He had finally found a home, and Dorothy had found the son she never thought she would have. As she wiped away tears of happiness, Dorothy realized that everything she had gone through was worth it. She had made the right choice, and all her efforts had not been in vain. Surrounded by her new family, Dorothy vowed to give Nicholas the life he deserved. She promised herself, and those who had supported her, Eric, Ethan, and Mr. Cobb, that she would always take care of Nicholas, nurturing him in a loving and happy home. Nicholas quickly became the light of her life, a constant source of joy and inspiration. Dorothy began making plans for their future together, visiting all the interesting places in the city, building sandcastles on the beach, and reading every fairy tale she could find. Life was full of promise, and for the first time in a long while, Dorothy felt a deep, abiding sense of peace and fulfillment. She had lost much, but in the end she had gained something far more precious: the love of a child who needed her as much as she needed him. During a quiet afternoon walk in the park, as Nicholas watched other children playing joyfully, a question weighed heavily on his little heart. He turned to Dorothy and asked, "Will you never give me back to that uncle?" The fear in his voice was palpable, a lingering shadow from his past. Dorothy, feeling the depth of his uncertainty, sat down on a nearby bench and pulled him into a comforting embrace. "Never, Nicholas," she whispered, her voice full of love and assurance. "You are my family now. I will always be by your side, and I will never leave you." As she spoke, Dorothy couldn't help but recall the spiteful words Lucas had hurled at her during the custody battle. "You will never understand what it means to be a father." She never truly understood why he had said that, but she knew one thing for sure: Lucas, an alcoholic lost in his demons, could never grasp what it meant to be a mother, to love unconditionally, and to sacrifice everything for a child's happiness. Even as she built a new life with Nicholas, Dorothy kept in touch with Eric and Ethan. Ethan, who had once been lost and broken, had found a new purpose in life. After regaining his identity and reconciling with his long-lost parents, who had thought him dead, Ethan took over the management of the city cemetery when Mr. Cobb retired due to health reasons. Mr. Cobb, having finally made peace with his daughter-in-law, was allowed to see his grandchildren, bringing a long-awaited joy to his twilight years. Ethan quickly proved himself to be a capable and dedicated manager, transforming the cemetery with his leadership and hard work. While Dorothy's relationship with Ethan remained purely professional, her bond with Eric grew stronger with each passing day. Eric, the former police officer who had become her steadfast ally, played a crucial role in helping her clear her name. The evidence he provided, including the photos showing the empty coffin at Scott Reynolds' supposed grave, had been instrumental in Dorothy's reinstatement at the hospital. The department head and chief physician, facing irrefutable proof, publicly apologized to her, restoring not only her job but also her faith in justice and the future. It was Dorothy who encouraged Eric to apply for experimental bionic prosthetics that were said to revolutionize the field of prosthetics. Always a fighter, Eric eagerly volunteered to be one of the first to try out these medical marvels, not just for himself but to help improve the technology for others who might need it. Meanwhile, news about Scott Reynolds remained sparse for months until, out of the blue, the elusive businessman returned to his homeland. He didn't come alone. Two formidable-looking foreigners accompanied him, and they escorted him straight to the nearest police station, where Scott made a full confession. As it turned out, Scott's desperate attempt to reconnect with his supposed millionaire father, John Skinner, had been a colossal failure. The relationship between them had soured almost immediately, leading Scott to realize that his grand plan was doomed from the start. The truth that emerged was far more complex. Somewhere out there, a true heir to Skinner's fortune lived in obscurity, completely unaware of his origins. This heir, whose existence might have remained a secret forever, had unwittingly set off a massive search when Skinner, feeling the pressures of age, decided to find the son he had lost many years ago. The search was extensive and meticulous. Skinner's team scoured orphanage records, funded renovations in educational institutions, and equipped them with the latest technology, all in hopes of uncovering clues about his lost son. These efforts, unknowingly, also benefited thousands of orphans who suddenly found themselves with access to new resources. 6 months later, the search bore fruit. An international blood bank and donation center revealed a nearly perfect DNA match. The revelation stunned everyone. The lost heir was none other than Eric, the unassuming taxi driver with a past in law enforcement, Initially, no one could believe it. It seemed too surreal, too much like the earlier false lead with Scott Reynolds. But after Skinner insisted on a repeat DNA test, the results confirmed what seemed impossible. Eric was indeed Skinner's son. Standing on his new bionic legs, Eric could hardly believe what was happening. Was this real? Could he, a man who had grown up in an orphanage, really be the son of a millionaire? It felt like a dream, one he feared would vanish if he blinked. But it was real as the man standing before him who looked so much like him, only older. "Forgive me, son, for finding you so late, mister," Skinner whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Eric, overwhelmed by the truth of it all, shook his head. "There's nothing to forgive," he said, before introducing the two people who had become his family. "This is Dorothy, my wife," he said, though they had yet to marry, "and this is our son, Nicholas." The technicality of their marital status didn't matter. What mattered was the love that bound them together. Mr. Skinner, overjoyed by the news that he was to be a grandfather, immediately set to work planning a grand wedding for Eric and Dorothy, determined to make up for lost time. And as if the news couldn't get any better, Dorothy revealed that she was pregnant, bringing even more joy to their already blessed union. As Eric stood with his newfound family, he marveled at the twists and turns his life had taken. From a childhood in an orphanage to a career as a police officer, from losing his legs to finding love and family, and now discovering that he was the heir to a vast fortune. Life had been hard, but it had also been full of unexpected blessings. And now, with Dorothy by his side and Nicholas calling him Dad, Eric felt like the luckiest man in the world. The future was bright, full of hope and endless possibilities. As we reach the end of this incredible journey, we've witnessed how life can take unexpected turns, from despair to hope, and from loneliness to love. Dorothy's determination, Eric's resilience, and the warmth of new beginnings with Nicholas remind us that no matter how tough life gets, there's always a way forward. Each character in this story faced their challenges, but with perseverance and support, they found the strength to overcome them and build a brighter future. So what have you learned from this story? What lesson stands out to you that you can bring into your own life? We'd love to hear from you, so please comment below with one thing you've learned and how you plan to put it into practice. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your support helps us bring you more stories that inspire and uplift. Thank you for watching.